Hello and welcome to Module 6B of our course on bilingualism, literacy, and language. In this session, we will bring together the theories that we have discussed in 7 pedagogical practices. Most of the content will not be new, but it is very important to see it together in the instructional framework so as to make connections and move into applications. Therefore, this session will have two objectives. One is for participants to be able to structure old understandings into a set of pedagogical practices, and secondly, for participants will be able to or will learn at least one new bilingual pedagogical practice and apply it for the week. So feel free to take notes throughout the session and highlight at the end one practice that you would like to put into action so that we can discuss it during our live session the following week. These 7 pedagogical practices for bilingual language education were proposed by Osa Martinez and Herrera and Skibbins, and they were presented by L. Rice, a non-for-profit that works very closely with the California Bilingual Association. So the first one is to establish a clear language allocation and strategic separation of languages, and it might seem apparently that number 1 and number 4 are in contradiction, but they're not, and both are very necessary, and we will discuss why. So the second practice is to actively affirm the status of the language other than English, the LOTE, as we equalize the status of cultures, building sociocultural competence. 3, provide all students with strategically coordinated and aligned literacy instruction in both languages, using authentic systems or authentic ways for each system. 4, build cross-language connections, transfer and metalinguistic understandings. 5, promote opportunities for language choice, support bilingual identities, and active bilingualism. So 4 and 5 need to be understood also at this point very well, because we're also insisting on number 1, which is a clear separation of languages. Number 6 is integrate content with language and literacy development, using content as a bridge across languages. This is supporting what Maria Brisk stated about language being functional. So we teach through language, we don't teach language. And lastly, assess in both languages to inform instruction. So while we've emphasized translanguaging and using the repertoire of the student, bringing an end to a hegemonic perspective of hierarchical languages, we also need to emphasize this first principle to establish a clear language allocation between the languages and separation of language. Not necessarily for learning, because a learner will also be using his or her complete repertoire, because that's how the brain works. But for instruction, we need to create spaces for both languages to be taught. So the learner needs to hear it spoken with integrity and authenticity. They need to be immersed. They need to be motivated to learn the specific language that maybe it's minoritized or not as common for the student or as easy for the student. And they need to have multiple opportunities to internalize the functions. So time in task will be key for new language learning, as we know. So part of this implies when we're using a language, we don't translate. Very different from code switching. If you translate, as we know, the brain just gets used to, the students' brains get used to just waiting for the translation to come. Also, it means that there's an expectation of which language we're supposed to be using. If students are given the opportunity to use their holistic repertoire, that needs to be explicit as well. But when a student needs to practice in a specific language, it needs to be brought up as well and explain to the student that we're going to make an effort in a language that we might need to develop so that it can catch up. However, the student knows that they're always free to use their holistic repertoire to communicate with the teacher, and also that there will be moments coming where they can use translanguaging, etc. Second, actively affirm the status of the language other than English and equalize the status of cultures, build sociocultural competence. Toward the end, I will be talking more broadly about sociocultural competence in a different session, different module. However, here we bring up the fact that there is an intentional centering of the language other than English in all school events, and that we're ensuring the quality of materials in both languages, not only English. Third practice, we've spoken about it mostly in this course, while the first two practices were covered mostly in the first course. We provide all students with strategically coordinated and aligned literacy instruction in both languages, authentic to each. This is pointing toward our emphasis during instruction to know what language we're going to be teaching. So what is the language objective depending on the languages we're teaching, and also what are the meta-linguistic objectives during that lesson. It also has to do with having clear standards and understanding the differences in the structures of the languages. So, for instance, while the syntax of a sentence structure might be similar with some differences in languages, we know that the phonetics, for instance, in Spanish and English are very different, so we respect the structures when we teach it. As we have said before, in Spanish, for instance, we begin with the vowel sounds because they say their name and are simple, and use that to expand on the consonants. In English, we might start with one vowel sound and several consonants, waiting to expand into the other vowel sounds. Additionally, while in pre-K, developmentally speaking, the student might not be ready for English spelling. In the pre-K student is developmentally ready for Spanish spelling because of its transparency. It's more connected to the symbolism of brain functioning, which is we're wired with genetically. Our fourth principle speaks of the need to build cross-language connections, transfer, and meta-linguistic understandings. As we have said before in the course, there are common underlying proficiency principles or aspects or understandings in all languages or linguistic systems, but then there are specific features for each to be taught. And it focuses, therefore, this metalinguistic understanding means that we actually can think about language, see the differences and the commonalities between languages, and be able to do positive, negative, and zero transfer connections. And we will talk a little bit about that. So this is a positive transfer. Skills work the same similarly in both languages. Here, for instance, the sound of the mapa, maestra, mascota, moon, mouse, map, it includes cognates, certain letter sounds, some writing systems. And then we also teach that there's negative transfers. Skills work differently into languages. Pie is different than pie, even though we must spell it the same. And also there's other methods of writing the date. For example, in not only we don't capitalize dates, but we also place first the day and then the month when we only use numeric in Spanish. And finally, there's the zero transfer. It occurs in one language but not in the other. And here are a couple of examples: the ñ sound in Spanish and the th sound in English. And there are specific moments or ways in which we can foster metalinguistic understanding. We can give students opportunities to discover cognates, linguistic connections. I used to have cognate delegates in my classroom, and every time there was a cognate that would come up, they would ring a bell, like click a little bell, and we would stop and write the cognate. And you can switch responsibilities. There's many other ways. You can also use teachable moments when it comes up, or you can intentionally dedicate some time to teach side by side the differences and the similarities. Our fifth principle is to promote opportunities for language choice, support bilingual identities, and active bilingualism. This is connected to sociocultural competence, and the foundation of all this is identity affirmation, which we spoke about in our first course. So this develops strong bilingual identities, and this has been connected to academic success. It supports translanguaging, allowing students to decide language use, understand how the context determines code switching or use of language, and they actually have the freedom to choose, but at the same time applying sensibility so that they expand their opportunities and be able to be in different workplaces, since they know which context it is and what language or code to use when choosing language. And here are some ways to teach this independence of language use with responsibility. Free language choice, reading in one language, responding in another, drawing common resources across languages, exploring their language identities, histories, and heritages, etc. In my classroom, I found that modeling this thinking process of when and how to use languages separated in a separated form or translanguaging, it's really important for them to understand. It's not that you're putting one language above or you're denying your ability to use your whole repertoire, but it means that you have the freedom to choose. And to be able to choose, you need to master different ways of doing it. So you can practice using translanguaging, you can practice using only Spanish or only English or the other Lotte language. Our sixth principle is to integrate content with language and literacy development using content as a bridge across languages. So content serves as a bridge between languages, and language is given meaning and purpose through developing content knowledge. So as we know as linguists and educators, we do not teach language in isolation. It's always within context. Even the development of phonemic awareness and phonics has to be within context. And this is two specific ways in which we can apply it in the classroom. First, when the setting is that of a side-by-side team teaching model, teachers need to collaborate to plan where content is addressed in both languages, and there's never repetition in the languages. You pick it up where you left it in the other language. Finally, assess in both languages to inform instruction. There will be a module on assessment, but briefly we'll just mention these 5 items. Assess both language development and academic development in both languages. Use multiple measures of assessment. Assess across language domains, speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Employ assessment methods that use a dual language lens. Be aware of the students' bilingualism and the context they might be in and understand. And collaborate across languages to plan meaningful assessments. More on this when we reach our module on assessment. And this finalizes our short session on the pedagogical practices for bilingual education, which the intention was to help us bring everything together in terms of theory, see how they apply in these 7 practices, and begin our conversation on the application of the theory. Thank you very much. Feel free to contact me if you have any question or if you need assistance.